Welcome, friends, to Seeking the True Self webinar. We are exploring 4 different approaches to self-knowledge based on the teachings that we find in some theosophical authors. In our previous week, we went through the approach that I called self-examination, in which we start the first, let's say, aspect of self-knowledge, which implies getting to know our personal self, how our personality tends to deal with the world, with life, with ourselves in different aspects. In this, based on the idea of the paramitas, of the virtues, we looked at how the personality acts and try to understand why it acts in a certain way or in a different way. So this is the first level of self-knowledge, which is more or less within the field of psychology also. As we move forward in this class, we will start exploring some methods that are really beyond the reach of modern psychology. But this aspect is more or less within that field. Now, today what we are going to do is to examine the nature of our personal self, whether what we call the personal self is a homogeneous entity, or it is a mental construct, or it is a misperception. We will see all this. But we are going to start trying to pierce through the field of consciousness that we normally know, that is the field of my thoughts, my emotions, my body, sensations, etc. So the technique we are going to explore today is a technique of self-inquiry, and we will see what we mean by this. Let us start with some introductory concepts. This is written by William Judge, one of the founders of the Theosophical Society. He says, "There is but one universal mind. It is differentiated in human beings of the average order and more or less vitiated by desire." So he's postulating there is a universal mind. Universal mind means a mind that pervades everything. And that universal mind, which is one, expresses through human beings, but then its nature is tainted or is colored by desire. And when the universal mind, in its universal aspect, is beyond personal preferences and therefore the possibility of not being fair, the possibility of having predilections, the universal mind is beyond all that. In human beings, when it starts expressing itself through our personal nature, it gets colored by our desires, by our experiences, by the personal relationships we have with people. In a normal, let's say, situation, this is not necessarily too problematic, but we can see how there is the seed of potentially a lot of unfairness, and we actually see it in the world, where some people or countries or organizations are ready to destroy somebody else, whether another organization or people or country, to defend what is regarded as my own, simply because I'm more associated to this particular people or organization than to the other. But there is a possibility of having a different relationship with those who are closer to us. That's something that is more or less normal. However, there is a possibility, as I was saying, of having this more personal relationship without falling into unfairness, for example. And we will see a little of this. Now, he goes on and says, when a person broadens to the universal, this higher mind, in its original purity, is a state of being and not an organ. So he's postulating that there is a higher aspect in ourselves, this higher mind, which is more, it's a more kind of expanded state of awareness. And as he says, this is a state of being. This is, he says, not an organ, whether a physical organ or a spiritual organ. I think what he means is that here we are talking about awareness and not the vehicles through which the awareness expresses itself. Like on the physical plane, our awareness needs a brain, needs a body, with all the complexity of the body to express itself. And therefore, since the awareness is using something to express itself, it gets conditioned by that vehicle of expression. For example, we can express our sense of beauty through painting, but then the very means that we use to express ourselves will set a limitation as to how we can express our sense of beauty. If we use another means, then we will have the possibility of expressing beauty in other means that painting doesn't allow, for example. But then these other means won't allow a certain expression that painting may. So we have to understand that all vehicles of expression have these two aspects. One, they allow our expression, the expression of consciousness, but at the same time, they condition that expression to a certain, way. So he's saying this universal mind, when expressing through our personal self, gets conditioned. Now, there is a possibility of being in this state in which we become the universal mind, so to say, and that universal mind is not being conditioned by a personal vehicle of expression. So he says, in order to realize this, it is necessary to withdraw our consciousness gradually and persistently from the illusion of the senses to the ecstasy of inward vision. That is, to gradually elevate the plane in which our consciousness works. So this is the principle that we are going to explore tonight. The idea of gradually withdrawing our consciousness from a certain plane of perception. So, for example, when we are perceiving through our bodies, we naturally see that everything is separate from us, it's outside ourselves. Perhaps if we, instead of perceiving what we call visible light, we perceived heat, for example, perhaps our sense of being separated would not be so sharp, because as we know, when you see through the heat cameras, the limits are not so definable. But our senses, because the senses were designed to preserve our individuality, to survive as an individual, a separate individual, the senses chose to show the world to our consciousness in sharp, separated ways. So we see the world, we emphasize the separation aspect in the world. Now, if we are going to perceive other aspects in which perhaps there is not this separation, we need to learn how to withdraw our awareness from this level of consciousness, from this plane of consciousness. And in doing so, we will begin to have a sense, a perception, a feeling that is different from the one that our senses, our normal waking consciousness brings. So today we will see how we can do this. Sri Ram, who was an international president of the Theosophical Society, talks about meditation in this way. He says the first object in meditation is to discover one's own spiritual selfhood as distinct from the personal vehicle, physical, emotional, mental, and the consciousness active within them. So we start from the premise that there is a selfhood beyond the mental level, beyond the emotional level, and the physical one. This is where psychology, modern psychology, stops. It normally stops at the level of our mind, at the level of the ego, what in theosophy we call the personal ego. Normally, most psychologists will regard that there is no possibility of perception beyond the mind. Even if we talk about the collective unconscious, that is all within the psyche. Whether the personal unconscious within the personal psyche or the collective unconsciousness within the collective psyche, but that all is part of the mental and emotional life of a human being and of humanity. What Sri Ram is saying here is that the purpose of meditation is to begin to perceive something that is beyond this level. I always say that from a certain point of view, the theosophical teachings start where the teachings in psychology ends. The purpose of psychology is to bring a person to have a healthy personal ego. And then once one is more or less in that state, because from a certain point of view, as we are going to see today, there is no possibility of a perfectly healthy ego, because the ego itself is a mistake in perception. The ego itself, as we are going to see, is the source of what we call, let's say, disease. But it is true that before one can transcend this level, the mental, emotional, and physical level, there is the need for a certain order in these levels. Now, as Sri Ram says, meditation, or at least this approach to meditation, is the first aim is to show us that there is an aspect of ourselves beyond the mind, beyond the emotions, beyond the body. And he says that we begin with an exercise in disassociation, seeking both to realize the distinction between the immortal spiritual self and the mortal changing personality. We then come to realize that the spiritual self of a person is forever an integral part of the spiritual self of the universe, the all-pervading Supreme Lord. So in these two stages that he talks about, the first is to discover that spiritual nature in us that transcends the personal nature. And then as we become more and more familiar with that spiritual nature, we come to realize that it's not my spiritual nature, that this is the spiritual nature of the universe. And we all are an expression of this. We begin to realize ourselves as non-limited, non-personal. Of course, the expression through this personality will be a personal expression. It's like if each one of us was a piece of colored glass. There is white light that is coming through all these different pieces of glass. They all have different colors, and therefore the rays that express through each one of these pieces is different, is individual, is particular. However, what we have to realize is that we are the white light. which in the case of this body is expressing itself through this particular color. So in a sense, a person that realizes the universal self can see both sides of this phenomena that we call human beings. It can realize the white light aspect, the perception that there is only the universal, and it is only in the universal that there is true peace, true love, true harmony. And then there is also the personal expression, and the personal expression, being a fragment, lacks other things. The red ray is not blue, it's not green, it's not yellow, so it lacks other aspects which are all synthesized in the white light. So in our personal expressions, there is always this feeling of lacking something. That's why we need to achieve, we need to accumulate, we need to relate. There is always this sense of lack. As we realize our universal self, the sense of lack is gone. Now, many people think if we don't need anything, if we don't have a sense of lack, that therefore we would remain aloof, we would never relate, we would never love. But what we can see in enlightened beings is just the opposite, because all feelings of love, all feelings of compassion, peace, all these things are actually the true nature of the universal. And when the personal doesn't stand in the way of the eternal, of the universal, then all these qualities can express themselves in a purer way, let's say. This is partly what we worked on last week in the meditation on the virtues, that one of the steps was to realize that the essence of ourselves is this perfection. All virtues that we describe are nothing but the essence of what we are, which as the personal obstacles are removed, they can express themselves more and more. So now Blavatsky will examine a little what we mean by myself. So she says, you see, Mr. Smith, or whoever it is, you can put your own name, really means a long series of daily experiences strung together by the thread of memory and forming what Mr. Smith calls himself. But none of these experiences that we go through daily life or that we have inside of ourselves are really the I or the ego, nor do they give Mr. Smith the feeling that he is himself, for he forgets the greater part of his daily experiences, and they produce the feeling of egoity in him only while they last. The quotes goes on, but let's clarify some of the terminology here. So Blavatsky used the word ego here in the Greek sense. The word ego in Greek means simply I-ness. As I said, from the psychological point of view, there is only one expression of I-ness. This I-ness that says, I am Pablo, I am my history, I am my memory, I am my conditioning, my will, my desires, etc., etc. If you see many times in philosophy, and it is reflected in movies also, whenever they talk about the continuity of consciousness, normally the movies go around transferring from one body to the other memory. Basically the memory. They download the memory somewhere and they can upload it again in another body in different ways depending with the movie. Because the general view of consciousness is what Blavatsky is saying here, is this collection of experiences strung together by memory. This is the sense of identity. I am Pablo, and this sense of I am Pablo depends on memory. If I lose my memory, I don't know who I am. I'm not Pablo any longer. To the others, I may seem to be still Pablo because there is a continuity in the appearance of the body. But psychologically, if I don't remember my past, my experiences, I am not Pablo any longer. So the work of memory, or the quality of memory, is very important in sustaining this kind of I-ness, which is what in Theosophy we call the lower ego. But Blavatsky is saying here, there is a higher aspect of I-ness, a sense of I-ness that is not tied to the personal story, to the personal history, to our memory, conditioning, learning, etc. There is a higher sense of I-ness, which Blavatsky says is the source of this feeling, I am Pablo, but it's independent from all the personal aspects. And she says that it is this feeling that gives me the sense of I am still the same person. Even though everything changes, as we are going to see later, we still have a sense that I am the same person. And we will see this in more detail. So Blavatsky says, we Theosophists, therefore, distinguish between this bundle of experiences, which we call the false personality, and she says false because it is finite and evanescent. So we distinguish between this false personality and that element in us to which the feeling of I am I is due. It is this I am I which we call true individuality. So Blavatsky uses these two words. She talks about individuality as this feeling of I am I, and personality as the feeling I am Mr. Smith. And there is a big difference here. By the feeling of I am I, she means the simple sense that I am. I am I as opposed to I am Pablo. I am I in the indefinite sense, in the non-defined sense. I just am. When I say I am Pablo, immediately that means if I'm Pablo, I am not you, I am not that, I am not the other. When I define myself as being a fragment, I am automatically separated from the rest. But Blavatsky says there is another feeling. There is a feeling of I amness, which doesn't put limits on itself. It's just the sense of being, the sense of existing. We all know that we are, without any definitions. When we say what we are, then we are conditioning this sense of just being. And we will see all this. Let's go little by little. So Blavatsky says that this lower sense of I-ness, this personal sense of I-ness, deluded into a notion of independent existence and thinking itself as the producer and the sovereign of the senses and their perceptions, becomes egoism, the selfish self. So here again there are severally important concepts. First, that the lower ego is deluded into a notion of independent existence. This is something that we all feel, that I am independent. I have this desire because this desire is mine. I am the producer of this desire. I am the producer of this thought. I am the producer of this action. Now, when we start really inquiring into the nature of this personal self, we begin to see that that is not true at all. And we will do or talk about some exercise to inquire in this way. But for example, a very simple example, we feel like eating a sweet. And we say, I have the desire to eat the sweet. I have free will. I am choosing to eat this. Now, what do we mean by this is my desire? Because, for example, the sense of desiring to eat sweet may be triggered by the bacteria in our gut. They need sugar, and they have a way to generate certain substances that the body interprets as its own desire to eat sweets. Many of our desires that we call ours, are not really coming from our consciousness. They may be coming from the body, they may be coming from the environment, they may be coming from different aspects of the universe. Same with our choices, same with our actions. If we really start looking, examining carefully what the nature of our being, we begin to see all this. Sometimes you go to a crowd, you are in a crowd, and you have certain desires, or you do certain things, or you are in a certain mood that you would not in some other circumstances. So is this mood, are these desires or these actions, are you independent? Were they self-determined? Or we are the expression of the whole cosmos around, a whole set of influences on different levels come out into a particular action. So we'll see all this little by little. I'm trying to present certain key ideas that will be the basis for our exploration. So, what The Voice of the Silence, a book written by Blavatsky, says is that the first thing we should do is to search for the thinker in us, for the thought producer. Let me read it from The Voice of the Silence. He who would hear the voice of the soundless sound, it's a way of talking about the spiritual voice, the spiritual insight, and comprehend it, he has to learn the nature of deep concentration. As we are going to see in this self-inquiry, we need to look very carefully, go through a kind of inquiry very carefully in a very focused way. So the Voice of the Silence says, first, one has to become indifferent to the objects of perception. In regular meditation, the first step is to withdraw your attention from what the senses bring. Otherwise, we are constantly distracted. So first we do that. Then we focus our attention in this inquiry, and then we start looking, we start searching. What do we search? The Voice of the Silence says, once we are indifferent to the objects of perception and we are in this focused state of awareness, the pupil must seek out the king of the senses, the thought producer, he who awakes illusion. The Voice of the Silence is based on, according to Blavatsky, on Yogacara. It's a Yogacara Buddhist text. And in the Yogacara tradition, we have the consciousness, the types of consciousness that come through our senses. So visual consciousness, olfactory consciousness, etc. So we have these 5 senses. Then there is a 6th sense, not referring to clairvoyance or anything like that, but they refer to the mind. The mind as this mechanism that brings together all this sense perception and puts it together into a coherent image, into a coherent information. And it is the mind then, the king of the senses, because the mind is the one that organizes what the senses bring separate from each other. And it is said that this mind is the one that awakens the illusion. In this system, one aspect of the mind is the sense of the I consciousness, the sense of I-ness, which is while the mind brings together all the sensory information, there is another higher aspect which interprets all this in a self-aware way, is the sense of I-ness. But then the sense of I-ness generates the impression that we are these senses, that the world is outside, separate from us, that we are this body that has these senses, that all these images happen within my mind, which is separate, independent from other minds. So it is this aspect of the mind, which is the king of the senses, that also awakens the illusion, the sense of I am Pablo, I am this mind, this thinking process, these emotions, etc. So then the voice of the silence says the mind in this aspect is the great slayer of the real. Let the disciple slay the slayer. So the point here is that the mind many times, or we would say this aspect of the mind, presents to us an illusion. As I said at the beginning, even scientists are realizing that our brain, they can only examine the physical counterpart of the mind, that is the brain. And they say the brain was never designed to bring to us reality. The brain was designed to bring us a certain illusion, a certain icon of reality, in a way that is useful to preserve the body. So the brain is not designed to bring you spiritual truth, to bring you a spiritual perception. How come that all the spiritual sages say that there is unity and we only see separation? Well, this is because the brain is designed to bring you the world in terms of separation. When we can perceive from a higher point of view, we can understand how all this separation is just an illusion, how everything is one. But this, of course, is a perception that is beyond the mind. We may understand the logic of it if we study and examine the foundations, the justifications for this view, but essentially it's something that is beyond the mind. So the voice of the silence is saying here that we have to search for the thought producer, which is the aspect of our mind that generates the illusion. And in that very searching and discovering the thought producer, then the slayer of reality is slayed in its turn. And we will see what that means. So Blavatsky says, in the act of self-analysis, or we would say self-inquiry in this context, the mind becomes in its turn an object of perception to the spiritual consciousness. You see, when we look from our mind, from the thinking principle in us, what we see outside of ourselves are objects of perception, are the things that we perceive. We are the subject of perception, we as the mind in this state of consciousness, and everything that is outside of myself is the object of perception. Now, Blavatsky says when there is an inquiry when there is a looking at the mind, now the mind becomes an object for something deeper, which is the spiritual consciousness. She says that in the act of self-inquiry, of looking into the nature of the mind is overshadowed in the sense of the mind is under the influence, in a sense, is overshadowed by buddhi. Buddhi is a Sanskrit word that means awakening in the sense of spiritual awakening in the Theosophical literature is the source of wisdom. It is the overshadowing of the mind by buddhi, by the inherent wisdom in us, which results in the ultimate realization of existence, that is, self-consciousness or self-awareness in its purest form. So basically what she's saying is that when we start examining our minds, if we do it in the correct way, and it's not just an intellectual examination in which the mind is just playing a game, examining another part of the mind, but when we start looking at the mind from the point of view of a deeper awareness, and we will see all this, who is looking at the mind? Blavatsky says, the one that is looking is this state of wisdom that is buddhi. And now the mind, which before was the subject that perceived things outside, now the mind becomes the object that is perceived by wisdom. And when this happens, there is what she says, self-consciousness or self-awareness in its purest form. Remember that there is a level of self-awareness, this sense of I am Pablo, which is conditioned, which is limited, is defined. But we said that there is another state of self-awareness, which is the pure sense of I amness, I exist, with no sense of I exist as who, as this or that. We are talking about a state of consciousness in which there is a pure sense of being, silent sense of being, without limiting I am this or that. And that is pure self-consciousness. And this is important because in that state of pure self-consciousness, that state of pure self-consciousness is one that let go of the limitation and is open to perceive something different. So we'll see that. So let's see how Besant explains this. She says, you realize that there is much in you that is changing and is not permanent. Your body is changing. Your emotions are changing. Your thoughts are changing. Those then belong to the unreal and not to the real. You know, the idea is that whatever is real cannot cease, is eternal, is always there, and obviously something that appears and disappears is not real in a metaphysical sense. It's real in the sense that it is there, but it's transitory. So what we are trying to look for in this approach to self-knowledge is, can we perceive something in us which is permanent, which is not appearing and disappearing, constantly changing? So when we start looking at the body, the emotions, and the mind, and we will do this in the exercise, we see that all that is constantly changing. And Besant says, those then belong to the unreal and not to the real. So in this inquiry, in your thought, you put those aside. There are different ways of doing this. I'm focusing now more on the concept than how to do it. We will talk about how to do it later. But she says, sometimes you examine these principles one by one, sometimes with the body, or you put aside a single sense like that of sight and try to realize the world as it would be without the sense of sight or any other sense that you please for the time, to force yourself into realizing that a particular sense is not yourself. We don't need to go too much into that. We'll talk about that later. Then Besant says, you feel an emotion and put it aside, shut it out, refuse to vibrate in answer to it. And you see those changing emotions are not yourself. Then those wandering thoughts that change with every breath, you put them aside and see that changing phantasmagoria of thought is not yourself. And so you shut out part after part, until perchance nothing seems left. For you find that all is changing, and you seek the real as the changeless. So basically, in this approach to self-inquiry, we are going to try to find what is permanent in us. We think that there is a permanent self in us. I went through all these years since I came into awareness when I was a child, and my body constantly changes, my emotions are constantly changing, my thoughts are constantly changing, and yet I feel I am the same person. Now, what is that permanent I-ness? Where is it? What is its nature? Is it true? Is it real? Or is it an illusion? What we will do in this approach is to start examining everything that we can find in our awareness and see if we can find something that is permanent. We will see that as we do this, and I'm going to explain that when talking about the exercise, but what we will see is the same that most traditions that engage in this kind of search find. They find that there is no permanent personal self. There is nothing within what we call our personality that is permanent. But we may discover that there is a permanent background, and that background, which is always there, may be the basis for our feeling of being always the same person in this case. But when we examine that background, we may find that that background is not personal. And this is precisely what Blavatsky says. The true self is per se impersonal. The personal or brain consciousness being but an illusory reflection in incarnated existence. So if we trust what Blavatsky is saying, we have to be ready to look into the impersonal. The impersonal, to the personal self that is listening, seems many times scary or tasteless or empty. And this is a barrier to discovering the deeper aspects of ourselves. Because we always live in the realm of the personal, it's difficult for us to conceive that there is existence in the impersonal. But as we begin to experience this state that we call impersonal or not personal, we begin to discover that this state is far deeper, far more harmonious, peaceful, far more loving than the state of personal self. And we will see that this impersonal nature can express in a personal way. But when this expression happens, having discovered the impersonal aspect of ourselves, the way in which it expresses changes. Maybe not so much externally, although it does change to some extent. We all recognize that wise people tend to be, let's say, better than other people in their interrelationships. So it does change to some extent, but the major change is an inner change in which the center of awareness is not confused any longer. It's not associating itself to something that is not its true nature. And there is great freedom in this. So we are just reading the map, and then we are going to talk a little more about what all this means, what it means to walk this map. So van der Leeuw, who was a Dutch theosophist, a very interesting person, he was quite a friend of Freud. Actually, Freud thought that he was going to be his successor. Unfortunately, van der Leeuw died he was a pilot, and he died in a crash with his aeroplane. But he's a very interesting theosophist. And he says, what remains of us after we take away our physical appearance, our desires and passions, our thoughts, our opinions and prejudices? In fact, all that which is our manifestation in daily life. So he's talking about the same kind of exercise that Besant was mentioning. What happens when in your search you let go of all these things? He says, apparently nothing is left when you let go of all that. And yet, when in meditation, we regularly make the attempt to disentangle ourselves from this temporary instrument, which we call our personality, there comes a moment when the void, which is left after all that is personal has been taken away, begins to be filled by the consciousness of our true self. You know, there is this typical example from Zen that made it to the movie, so probably many people are aware of this. But the idea that a cup that is full cannot receive anything else. It's full of tea or water or whatever it is, and there is no space to receive anything. So our field of consciousness is full with the personal self. Being full of the personal self, there is no room, no space for the spiritual in us. So if the spiritual is going to shine through us, we need to make room. We need to empty ourselves of everything that is changing, everything that is personal, and therefore can be let go of. We will see what this means. And only in making ourselves empty, something else can come and take its place. This was said by all mystics in all traditions. Patanjali, one of the fathers of yoga, as we understand the yoga as a spiritual discipline, not just the asanas or exercises. Shankaracharya, or in the Western tradition, Meister Eckhart, or many of the Christian mystics, they would say you have to empty yourself of yourself for God to come and take place or dwell in you. So this is a concept that is in most mystical or really spiritual traditions. So this is part of the process of self, or where the self-inquiry is going to take us. How are we going to proceed with this inquiry? We are going to search for the permanent element in us. As we said, we all have the sense that we are the same person since we were born. I always tell this joke in connection with this subject because I think it's a very philosophical joke, and it can illustrate our predicament, the situation in which we are. There are two friends, and one of them brings a sword and says, "This is a sword that my family has had for generations. Originally, it belonged to Alexander the Great." So the friend says, "Oh, wow," and starts looking at the sword. And then he realizes that the sword looks quite modern. So he tells his friend, "You know, this looks modern. I thought that the swords at that time were different." And the friend says, "Well, you know, in all these centuries, sometimes we had to change the hilt, sometimes we had to change the blade, but this is the sword that came from Alexander the Great. So if you change, you know, the two parts once and again throughout the centuries, what is left of the original sword? Only the idea of it." So the question is, and this is a problem in philosophy, in Western philosophy, the question of personal identity. Is this our case also? Is it that there is nothing permanent in us, and therefore, just like the sword, we have nothing really in common with the baby that was born? Or is there something that is permanent? Maybe we are just like the sword, and there is a continuity of change. This is what, in general, philosophers talk about. There is not a single atom in our bodies that was the same as in the case of the baby. But there is a continuity of change that we perceive. We are there at each step of the change, and therefore we have the sense that this is the same body, not because it's the same body in any way, but only because there is this continuity of change. Same with our emotions, same with our minds. Is there anything permanent? So what Blavatsky said in one of the quotes is that the personal self is just a bundle of things. It's a bundle of cells, a bundle of feelings, emotions, a bundle of thoughts, all brought together by memory. Therefore, there is nothing solid, nothing permanent within this personal self. And this is what we are going to inquire into. Let us seek and try to find where is this personal element. At least we can say that we have the sense that we are always the same. Where does this sense come from? Is it because there is something permanent, or is just an illusion? So we begin by searching on the physical level. We see that everything in our body is changing. There is, as I said, not a single atom that has been with us since our birth. So the first thing that we do is to reflect on this, trying to arrive at the feeling that we are in a different body from the one we were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or perhaps, yesterday. And yet we feel we are the same person. Therefore, there must be this sense of permanency has to be beyond the body. If it was based on the body, our sense of identity would change along with the body. For example, you may undergo an operation, a surgery, change your face, change your body, change your structure. You can change your name. Maybe you can make yourself look like somebody else and take this person's name. And yet, you will still have the sense that you are yourself. You may make yourself look like Einstein, but you are not going to suddenly believe you are Einstein. There is a sense of being yourself that is independent from the body. It's beyond the body, its appearance, it changes. So where is this sense of permanency? What's its basis? Let's look at the emotions. Knowing that it's not at the level of the body, let's drop the body in our mind, forget about the body, imagine that we don't have a body right now, and focus on your attentions and do this inquiry on your emotions and do this inquiry at that level. So examine now the emotional aspect. Again, meditate on the fact that emotions are constantly changing from one moment to the next. So we say, I am happy, I am sad, I'm excited, I am depressed, I am hopeful, I am bored. If you see, there is a constant change of emotions, and yet we feel that all this is happening to us. We are the same person to which all these different things are happening. So obviously, this sense of I-ness is beyond the emotions. Otherwise, we would change with the emotions. It's like, for example, if we have a piece of wood, it is a triangle. We can make the triangle red, we can make it blue, we can make it green, but the triangle itself is beyond these qualities that can be added to the triangle. So in a similar way, we feel that we are, and what emotions are in us are like external qualities. So obviously the sense of being, that permanent sense of being, is not at the level of the emotions. So let us drop the emotions. So far we haven't found anything that is permanent on these two levels. Therefore, they cannot account for our sense of being. So let's see at the level of thoughts. Again, we can see that our thoughts are constantly changing from one second to the other. The way I conceive of the world or myself is constantly changing. And even though, for example, today I may think this, I think that this is good. And tomorrow I realize, no, this is bad. There is a radical change in my thinking, and yet I feel I am the same. It's not that my person is now suddenly a different person. Only a quality of my person changed, which is my thought about this. So again, at the level of the thoughts, we cannot find something that is permanent. Memory has a lot to do with this, because even though, as we discussed, even though my body, my emotions, my thoughts are constantly changing, maybe what brings this sense of permanent being is my memory. I have the sense that what happened to that body that was the child that I say was myself, but it was a different body that had different emotions, that had different way of thinking, but somehow that experience remains in memory, and then the next one, and then the next one. And when it comes to the present moment, the memory of those experiences generates the sense, I went through this. But what do we mean when I say I? I as a body, the body is always changing. I as emotions, we saw they are always changing. I as these thoughts, we know they are always changing. What do we mean by I am going or went through all these experiences? This sense of identity is heavily based on memory. If we lose memory, all of a sudden, I will lose my sense of being Pablo. I know I'm Pablo as long as I have memory. If I lose all my memory, then I don't know who I am. So the sense of identity is based on memory. Now, as we look into this, we may arrive at the conclusion that the permanent sense of I-ness is beyond the physical, emotional, and mental levels. If you are not convinced, examine again and show me where there is something permanent within these fields, within the fields of thinking and memory, within the field of emotions, within the field of thoughts. So what are you? So the next step is there anything beyond all this? So you can try and look into what are you when there are no active sensations, feelings, or thoughts. That is, what are you when there is complete silence? Don't try to answer this question when you are in your inquiry. Don't try to answer this question because you are answering them by means of your thinking. But we have seen that the thoughts are a fleeting aspect of ourselves. So as Van der Leeuw said, as we go through this inquiry and we see that there is nothing permanent at the level of the body, we let it go. We forget about the body. Now focus on the emotions. Then when you realize there is nothing permanent here, let go of the emotions. Then you look at your thoughts and memory. When you realize there is nothing permanent here, let go of the thoughts. And try not to engage again in thinking, feeling, or physical sensation or movement. What is there when none of this is active? Do you disappear? If you are not thinking, if you are not feeling, if you are not moving, do you just disappear? Of course not. You are there. What are you in that state? Who are you in silence? What are you in silence? You are not a thinker. You are not a feeling entity. You are not a moving entity. What are you when none of these aspects are there? That is what we have to investigate, because the thinker, the idea of I am the thinker, is the one that generates this sense of I am the personality, I am Pablo. The one that is thinking now. Who is the one that is thinking now, speaking now, or listening to this now? Is there an entity doing this? We may say yes or no, but if there is an entity, we should be able to perceive it. So, for example, if I lose my memory right now here, would I be able to be saying all this that I am saying? Of course not. Therefore, what am I? Am I just memory? Or is there something beyond? Something that has nothing to do with the thinker itself. Memory goes, the thinker goes. Of course, new thoughts can be generated, but if there is an entity producing these thoughts, then that entity should be there always. When we look into this, all we see is that thoughts come one after the other, after the other, after the other. But is there an entity behind? So all these things are things that I'm not talking about philosophy here. I'm talking about inquiry. This is an approach to self-knowledge. Questions are more important than answers. So when you go through this process of self-inquiry, challenge everything. Try to see, ask questions and look. So what are you when there are no thoughts, when there is not a thinker? Simply pause and look. Be aware of the state of silence. The silence may last for a few seconds. You say, okay, I realize I'm not the body, I'm not the emotions, I'm not the thoughts. Therefore, I let go of all this. And then there may be a few seconds of silence before thoughts come again. Look deeply at that state in which you are not the thinker. There are no active memories. There is no active mental process. Look deeply at that and try to see what it is. Not try to think about that. Once you start thinking about the silence, you are thinking, not in silence. Simply perceive the silence and see what it is. What you will see, and I'm not going to describe what you will see, but what I mean is that what you will see is that you are still there, but that you which is there is not personal. It becomes personal when you begin to think again. Because when you are not thinking, when you are just in silence, you know that you are there. You are not saying it, I am here. For that you need thought. But when there is deep silence, you are there, you are present, you are aware that you are there, but you are not defining yourself. You are not aware of you as the person that is this way or that way. Now, as soon as you start thinking, that pure sense of awareness of just being becomes being this person with its own ideas and memories that says, yes, but what about this? Yes, but what about that? You can say that because of your past, your memory, or that says, oh, this is nonsense, or that says, oh, this is so inspiring. Whatever you can say about something, that is falling into the personal expression, which has been molded by the experience in your life. But before you fall into a personal expression, you are still there, but in an impersonal way. Impersonal in the sense of non-defined. If you can stay in that impersonal state, that state is open to a different sense of being. Probably it won't happen the first time you do it. It may not happen for 10 years. It may happen the second time you try it or the first, no expectations. The very fact of dwelling in the state of silence, where one is not constantly self-defining oneself, the very fact of dwelling there begins to produce a transformation in us. So this is the second approach that we are exploring to self-knowledge, in which we challenge all the field of what we perceive to be ourselves. And as we move on, we will keep going from there, keep moving forward.